We're here today to talk about the Disney Revolt, the Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age by Jake S. Friedman. I am Amit Amiti. I'm the publisher and a founder of Cartoon Brew. And I don't usually do these kind of interviews, but I absolutely love this book. And I asked our team, I said, can I do this interview? If you're a fan of animation's golden age, you have to run out and buy this book right now. If you're a Disney buff, you need this book. It will tell you things about the Disney studio that you never knew. And this is something I don't say too often, but if you work in the animation industry, you need this book on your shelf and you need to read it because it is a blueprint for how you organize a studio, how you fight for your rights, and how you win. And speaking of that, Jake, I guess my first question to you was, you've been working on this for a long time, this book, but the labor movement in animation was kind of dormant for many years. And really in the last couple of years, it's picked up. And I'm curious, when you were writing this, did you have in mind animation artists as an audience to read this book and to help them understand their rights? And was that ever like an intended audience, or were you writing this purely as a history book?
The undertone of the book changed over time. I've been working on it for so long. It started out just as a way to pay homage to the people who led the strike. So I wanted to pay homage to these folks. I wanted to pay homage to Art Babbitt, the animator who led that strike. And then as I went on with my research, I realized, oh, this is more than just about unsung heroes. I could make this exactly as you said, into a how-to guide for organizing and kind of like pull the curtain away and show these are some of the steps that you need to do. These are some of the people you need to talk to, some of the blueprint guidelines that you might want to follow. The book is written for a general audience, basically people who aren't animation aficionados, who don't know anything about the golden age of Disney, who know the name Disney and are curious to know about how you got from Steamboat Willie to Snow White, you know? And then that's the first part. And then the second part of the book is how we get from Snow White to the strike and what happened in the strike. And my original draft was about 50% longer than the book that you're holding. But I was able to sneak a lot of my fun facts in the notes section. So if anyone who's reading this book is like me and wants to know like what the source is, what the backstory is, what else is going on, I crammed as much into the notes section as I could. So there's a lot of really cool stuff there, basically just for the animation aficionados to follow along. If you want to know like who punched who in the face, just open the notes section and you'll see that, you know, Bill Pete punched Riley Thompson in the face.
Talk a little bit about your own background in activism and how you feel that influenced your desire to write this book.
Well, something that I grew up with ever since I was a little kid, in addition to, you know, Disney stuff and Disney Channel and going to Disney World and having the dolls and the toys and watching the cartoons, was I grew up seeing a photo of my dad being arrested for striking. He and my mom and my grandmother were teachers during the Philadelphia teacher strike of 1973. And all three of them were arrested for striking, and all three of them were jailed. And as chance would have it, there was a photographer for the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin right there when my dad was being taken from the paddy wagon to the precinct. So that became a piece of family lore and something that we grew up seeing. My dad on the cover of a newspaper being taken to jail for striking. So I grew up with that. And it wasn't like my parents always said, fight for your rights or anything like that. But they were always part of the teachers union. They were teachers until they retired. When I started working, you know, after college, I started to understand from some employers more than others why a union is important and why workers' rights need to be protected. And I was well aware, working in New York, I worked in New York my whole life, that we didn't have an animation union out here, out east. Only out west was there one. There used to be one out east. And so it was big news just recently when Titmouse over here in New York became the first unionized animation studio in decades. I mean, that was like raise the banner high, you know?
So you grew up knowing that, your dad was jailed for organizing, and that is very, like, there's very clear consequences and what that happen. And when you try to organize, when the Disney artists, when they were in 1941, they decided to organize. Do you think they were aware of how difficult it would be, or of the consequences that would happen, where it ruined friendships, it ruined relationships, not just for like a year or two, but for the rest of their lives? And I don't think anything like that would happen today in organizing. Do you think the Disney artists were even aware of what they were doing when they started this, of how much they would have to put in and what they would lose, as well as what they would gain?
Art Babbitt, who was the leader, and Dave Hilberman, who was the secretary, and a few other folks, they were coming from the East, from New York and other cities in the East. And activism in the East, kind of like it is now, is, a big rally, kind of like us versus them. And New York is still, as it was then, a hotbed of activism, which is what influenced Babbitt, because he worked in New York as a teenager until he went over to Disney's in 1932. So this us versus them attitude, I'm afraid to say that Babbitt brought that with him when he led the union at Disney, and making it us versus them. And I don't know if this is an official term, I'm just coming up with this now, but like vilifying the opponent was probably not the smartest move. I don't think he had the forethought to think, oh, I'm going to work with these people again. I'm going to be the employee of Walt Disney again if I get what I want. He was bringing New York style activism into the Hollywood union scene. So that probably made the strike more bitter than it needed to be. There was a lot of there were a lot of slurs. There were a lot of smears. I'm not saying that one person is at fault for this strike lasting 9 whole weeks, or even happening at all. I mean, there were a lot of different factors, and it didn't kind of spring out of thin air. It was the result of several years, since early 1938, that this happened, all the way, till it erupted in May 1941. I try to give a fair learning lesson that if you choose to be an activist for something like a union and you want to work for that boss again, don't vilify the boss. It will result in very tight tensions. And that's how, I guess, you have people after the strike who weren't speaking to one another. On the other side, you did have people who ended up striking and then going back to Disney and having a long, successful career at Disney, a couple of them becoming Disney legends even. So those were the people who were most even-tempered. Big surprise.
I want to take a step back now and talk a little bit about the structure of the book and how you came up with that. So you divide the book into 2 parts. And the first part is innovation, which is really about the development of the studio artistically in the 1930s. And I thought that was a really interesting choice, because you're setting the scene of this place being one of the greatest kind of hubs for artistry and artistic development. And the second half is when you really focus on the strike and what happened during that strike. But it seems that, if you read the first half of the book, you're like, this is the greatest place in the world. Like they're creating an art form. They basically invented the art of performance-based character animation right immediately before the strike happened. And so I'm curious, did you know that going in that they're so closely wrapped up with each other, the development of artistry and the discontent of artists? You would think that they would be really happy with what they were doing at the studio during that time.
It was something that kind of revealed itself as I was writing it. I wanted to understand how that mindset of your token Disney animator went from this is so cool, I'm part of something so amazing, to I'm so unhappy and I feel slighted. So I, at no point in my research of the period leading up to Snow White did I find anyone particularly unhappy. People who left the Disney studio before Snow White's premiere, it was mostly, from what I found, for reasons that they just wanted to go out on their own and be artists on their own. And everyone else kind of felt like they were part of this all for one and one for all mentality. Like, we're all in a ship together. And it was very risky to make Snow White. It was very risky to be to work on Disney cartoons because they were pumping a lot of money into each cartoon, and Walt wasn't pocketing it. I mean, they were seeing that Walt was buying Moviola machines for pencil tests, and Walt was hiring more and more people, as opposed to, the Terrytoon studio, which thankfully in my narrative, Babbitt worked at before Disney. So I'm able to clearly show how the Terrytoon studio did have a boss who pocketed the money and did not care about animation as an art form, just as product to like movie houses, to cinemas. Whereas Disney, did invest his time, money, and creativity in this. So all the animators were like on this great grand ship. And if it went down, they were going to go down together. And if they succeeded, they were all going to share in the spoils. And so Snow White happened and everyone is thrilled. Everyone put in all these extra hours. Everyone worked night and day by the end to make sure they met the deadline. And I thought this was such a great story. I mean, we should all aspire to be in a working environment where we're all on the same page and we're all feeling valued, and where our boss feels our loyalty. And loyalty was very important to Walt. He put that word in his title card of Snow White. He says, "Thank you for all your hard work and loyalty." So everyone who stayed to help him finish this dream that they bought in on had loyalty for Walt and his vision. Was a huge monster success. And they found that they weren't getting the treasures that they were promised. They wanted, this bonus pay that was in their contract. They wanted compensation and this financial incentive that the vice president, Gunther Lessing, promised them. And that's when things started to turn downhill, because the money they were seeing was getting pumped into the new studio in Burbank. And it was at that time that, we all, as we grow as workers, our priorities change. When we're fresh out of college, we'll pretty much do anything for all hours if we believe in the thing we're doing. Well, that's how it kind of was until, 1937, 38, when a lot of these guys were becoming, and women were becoming of like marriage age, or they wanted to buy a home, or they wanted to build a family. It was like a different stage in their adulthood. So they wanted that money for those practical reasons, not so they could work in a bright new studio, even with really fancy furniture. So it was very distinct, that line that was drawn after Snow White's success. Before, everyone was happy and believing in something. And then after, they felt like they didn't get the promise that fulfilled that Walt had made. And by Walt and Roy and Gunther Lessing, the vice president, unfortunately for Walt, he was like the figurehead of the studio. He wanted it that way. He wanted his name on the studio. So people were kind of angry at him, but it wasn't really so much him as the guy who was pulling the strings on how the contract looked, on how the bonuses worked. And that was Gunther Lessing, the vice president.
It's funny that a lot of the things that you mentioned, that in the official Disney narrative, they're the key kind of cornerstones of the studio's growth and success. Snow White, the first animated feature that they produced, this shiny Burbank studio that is still there today. And it's an iconic place in Hollywood. These are all the things that Disney is known for. Yet you're saying that these very exact things are what caused discontent among the artists and made them not like working at the studio.
Yeah. Well, also that Burbank studio not only had, all of these great amenities, which made a lot of people happy too. I'm not going to say it pissed off everyone. About half the people were thrilled with this, and half the people felt like they were slighted. And the half that were thrilled said, I can get my car service for free. There's an on-lot garage, and I can order a milkshake from like the local cafeteria, and they'll deliver it to my office anytime I want. This is awesome. And there's an athletic club that I can go to, and I can get trained by a real Olympian. That's awesome too. Well, the athletic club was only accessible to people earning $100 a week. That's a very, small amount of people. The average pay for like an assistant was around like $25 a week. In that action itself, there was kind of like a classism baked in. And Babbitt, into his old age, would talk about this. And he didn't like the fact that there were different kinds of carpeting on the floor. If you were a full-fledged animator, you had wall-to-wall carpeting. If you were an assistant, you had a small square. And if you were like an in-betweener, you had no carpeting, just linoleum floor. And maybe that was an incentive devised by the people running the company. Work hard and you'll get more carpeting. But Babbitt and others just saw it as a way to divide classes at the Disney studio, to create this class structure.
There's a story where two of the assistants, they were annoyed that they didn't have carpeting. So one night at 11 p.m., they went up to one of the empty offices that had carpeting. They spent hours pulling up the carpeting, bringing it back to their own office and putting it into their office. And then the next morning, all hell broke loose. They came down and they literally pulled out the carpet from under their feet. The studio custodians came and they pulled up their carpeting that they'd installed the night before and took it away from them. So it's a level of pettiness that is incredibly hard to understand for a studio that was doing so well at the time.
Yeah. And, right now, today, we have a lot of books on how to run a company. We have a lot of books on leadership. Right? Just go to like any self-help section of any bookstore, or, you'll see tons of books on leadership. Walt Disney, at that time, 1940, there really weren't any pieces of literature on how to lead a company. The creative side was trying to figure out how to create the best product. The management was trying to figure out what worked to incentivize artists. And as you just described, their efforts fell far short of what they thought would work.
The central figure in your book is Art Babbitt. And I know you spent many years researching his life. When you started researching his life, can you talk a little bit about how you discovered Art Babbitt? And did you start researching his life in the context of the Disney strike, or did it come from somewhere else?
It was going to be a biography, womb to tomb. And yeah, it was his widow, Barbara Babbitt. She passed away about 5 years ago. I didn't know this, but she was talking to a bunch of people. She said, I want my husband's story told. She found that most people didn't know who he was, or maybe his name was being omitted from mentionings. And she knew that he had a significant role during Disney's golden age. And she communicated to John Culhane, who at the time had authored the book on the making of Fantasia and the making of Aladdin and the making of Fantasia 2000. And he was teaching at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. He was teaching animation history. And he had taught me when I was there. I kept taking his class just because I loved him so much. I just audited his class. So until I graduated, I took his class every year. And he invited me back to speak to his students. And it was then that he told me that I would be writing the story of Art Babbitt, because that's just how John worked. This wasn't a question.
He told you, you didn't tell him.
Oh yeah, he told me. He said, you're going to write the story of Art Babbitt.
Why did he choose you?
Maybe it's because I was the only student who took his class 3 times by choice.
That's a good reason.
Like I called Barbara when he said, call Barbara. I was 26 and I was like, hi, John said to call you. But it's maybe about a year and a half. It wasn't until like I got a voicemail from Barbara maybe a year plus later. And she says, Jake Love, this is Barbara. You know, Bill Melendez passed away. Dina Babbitt, Art's previous wife, passed away. You better come visit me while I'm still here. Literally, that's what she said. Booked a flight, rented a car, stayed with her for several days. And this became a pattern every year. I would go visit Barbara Babbitt, stay at her house for like a week in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. And she had this room that was kind of like a garage, but there wasn't a garage door. It was just a room filled with stuff from her career as a dancer, actress in Hollywood, and filled with stuff from Art's career. And every time I would uncover something new, like filing cabinets of pictures that Art Babbitt had taken from his time in New York in the 20s, roaring 20s pictures. His ID card from Disney, 1936. Home movies that he had shot, letters that he got from Disney, and then stuff from his career after Disney. Like I opened a coat closet one time and I was like, I wonder what's in this cardboard box. And I opened the box that was on the floor, and there's every drawing from the sequence from Rudy Toot Toot of the lawyer doing his pirouette and his dance on the courtroom, like every drawing. And I'm flipping this. I'm like, this is the whole scene.
They were the original drawings.
The original drawings, every one of them. Through that, I got a good taste of who Art Babbitt was. Like I was able to, without meeting him, I mean, I was 11 years old when he died. I never met him. He valued animation education in a way like no one else, between like teaching at the Richard Williams studio and bringing the Disney Art School and being the first animation instructor to like teach the skills in Southern California in a classroom for credit. And all the stuff that happened to Babbitt after the strike, I just decided, this is its own story and this belongs someplace else. I'll sum it up here in an epilogue, but this is going to be a story about the defining moment of his life and of many people's lives who joined him.
I mean, as a person who's been overlooked by Disney history for so long, we know the 9 Old Men were responsible for the development of character animation. And your book makes a very strong case that, there was people like Babbitt before him, before the 9 Old Men, who were just as integral and important to developing what we know today as Disney animation. Yet you would never know that. It's very conveniently just, here's the 9 Old Men, right? They did it all. And so it's incredibly revealing as an artistic history, not just as a history of the labor strike, but as a story about the development of the Disney animation style, that Babbitt was very much a central figure in the development of the Disney style.
Yeah, and I give some book real estate to like this core group of animators like him and Les Clark and Dick Lundy and Norm Ferguson and of course Freddie Moore, who are all basically each of them kind of headed a different character. Like Freddie Moore is responsible for the redesign of Mickey and creating what Mickey looked like, and thereby, the Disney appeal. Dick Lundy was really the guy who figured out how Donald Duck worked. Babbitt, of course, is responsible for Goofy. He was just some sort of like animal-like gangly character. And then Babbitt decided to do this character analysis. He was inspired by Stanislavski and method acting, and he wrote this character analysis. I'm not even joking, though. He totally was. And he had books on method acting that became part of the Disney studio library. Wow. And he said, who is Goofy when you turn the cameras off? And he figured out, like in a 3-page treatise, who Goofy was. Norm Ferguson was the guy who gave Pluto life. And all these animators were integral to creating our core cast of characters. I call the group the art school graduates, because that's really where nearly all of the 9 Old Men came from. They came from art school, and they came a year or more after Babbitt joined the studio. And Babbitt, for one, was feeling very self-conscious how fast these guys were getting good. And so Babbitt was the man to figure out how live action reference could benefit animation, as opposed to rotoscoping, which is what the Fleischers had already done, where you literally trace the film. Babbitt was like, I have a character who dances, but I don't know how to dance. So I'm going to film someone who knows how to dance, and I will use that to inform my animation.
So you credit that Babbitt was the one who created that whole system.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And even Frank Thomas went on record saying that Babbitt created that. Character analysis that gave characters personality through that method acting technique. The in-studio art school that Babbitt spearheaded to bring art classes to the animators, that was all Babbitt. Like he did so much more than just being a lead animator. And he did more than like being the father of one of the core characters, like A Precious Few were. He brought in all of these innovations. He was like so tightly entwined with Walt's vision. It's almost Shakespearean how the two of them butted heads. They shared this vision. They both believed in working beyond what was realistic to attain this goal. The 9 Old Men, that term only came many years after the strike. They were all, great animators. It's a shame that Walt used the term 9 Old Men as a joke on, Roosevelt's Supreme Court, because there were far more than 9 artists who made significant contributions. And those 9 animators that he called the 9 Old Men were among the loyal animators, because loyalty was extremely important to Walt. And if you're someone like Babbitt who goes on strike, then there goes the loyalty.
So Art Babbitt is the central figure in this book, but it's important to point out that there's hundreds of artists on strike. Can you give me a sense of how many people went out on strike and how many people stayed within the studio?
So there were about 330 artists on strike, which is a lot of people. And they were accompanied by their, significant others or friends or, Warner Brothers folks or, anyone else who was sympathetic to them. So in the end, you have like hundreds of people outside the Disney studio gate. They had 24-hour pickets, which swelled during the clock-in hours when people are driving through the gate, and the clock-out hours when people are driving out of the gate. And during those times, that's when basically all hands on deck. Everyone came out to raise their signs, and about the same number stayed in. So it was kind of split down the middle. If it was less down the middle, clearly the strike would have ended, because everyone's trying to figure out who has the majority. And something that held it up was that the strikers said, we want a list of employees, and we'll have the names of our strikers, and we'll cross-check the names of our strikers against the employees. And Walt said, no, I want an election, a secret vote. Each side thought that their method was best and didn't trust the other method. Walt wanting a vote, that wasn't really how these things were settled. The labor board people who joined the strikers, who said a cross-check is really how these things are settled, and Walt just refused to do it. If not for that kind of almost half down the middle, it definitely would have ended sooner. And the strikers feared that if any of them, the strikers, would change their mind and become what they called scabs and walk inside the studio gates, suddenly we're doomed, because we've lost the majority. All it would take would be 10 or 20 strikers to just change their minds. And that was constantly happening. People on the inside and outside were constantly switching sides all the time. So it was never really a clear idea. I have a list in the appendix of about 320 strikers that came from a document, an animation history collection over at the NYU library that John Canemaker had collected. And that's from July. And in this list of strikers from July 1941, it amounts to about 320 people, but it does not have other strikers who had gone in already, including Hank Ketchum, the guy who would end up doing Dennis the Menace. Whenever there was a scab, there was a lot of booing, a lot of hissing, a lot of negative vibes, but people were constantly changing sides. And among the crafts that the strikers were making to inspire each other, there was that Gunther Lessing dummy, or the Gunther Lessing effigy. There was also a scab effigy.
Yeah, I know that even like Dave Swift, who was on the publicity committee, he went out early on, and then he went back in shortly thereafter, and he got so much hate from the strikers, who made fun of him, constantly as he tried to go back into the studio. Early on, he was fairly involved with the publicity for the strike, and it's just the tensions of how do you choose which side to go in. I have friends on the inside, I have friends on the outside. Which side do I choose? And whichever side you choose, you're going to lose, because there is no right side necessarily. It's just you have friends both places.
Yeah, and each side had their reasons, and the reasons were solid. I mean, this was a very economically difficult time, and people wanted to eat and survive, and people had bills to pay. Some had medical bills to pay. And I put a little bit in the book about Bill Teitla's wife, Adrienne. She was recovering from TB at the time, and they had a newborn who we all know was the model for Dumbo, right? Peter Teitla was the baby model for Dumbo. So they had this newborn. Teitla instantly went from being one of the highest paid artists at Disney, and therefore the world, to being paid zero for going out on strike. And it was such a drastic change for so many people that for whatever reasons they had, a lot of them stayed in or decided to go back in. Babbitt had the financial security that he could afford to go out, but a lot of people were living in tents, the tents that were set up just to, give shade for people during a hot day. A lot of people ended up living in tents and using the latrines on the lot as their personal latrines. And it just kind of became a little Hooverville.
Let's talk a little bit about the strike itself. It's really surprising how many twists and turns are in the strike, and also some of the characters involved in the strike. One of the most fascinating to me was this guy named Willie Byoff, who's essentially a gangster from Chicago, a Capone style gangster.
Oh yeah.
And he ends up taking control over Hollywood by running IATSE, which ironically, the Animation Guild today is Local 839 IATSE. They became part of IATSE I think in the 1950s. But back in the 30s and 40s, IATSE was essentially a gangster-run organization.
Yeah, it's cleaned up now. It's cleaned now.
Hopefully it's cleaned up, because they were, but it's really fascinating to me that the history of the strike, this is not just animation, we're going into Chicago gangland in many parts of your book. And then you have just these wild characters that you would not have expected to be a part of the strike. But then what's also fascinating to me is the integrity of the Disney artists who went on strike, because they constantly, as you point out in your book, they refused to work with Willie Byoff. They did not want. They knew he was a gangster, and they said, we want no part of this. And yet, I believe at some point, Walt says, okay, we're going to work with Willie Byoff. Can you talk? This is just incredible twists and turns that you really can't see coming, and you really don't expect in a story about an animation studio organizing. It's really enthralling.
I wish I could say I had the creativity to make that up, but no, that's all 100% true. It's really it's crazy what was going on at the time. The strike, well, the union even started when Babbitt got word that Willie Byoff, this gangster from Chicago, he was basically in the practice of blackmailing movie theater owners in Chicago. When as his power grew, and he became the entire West Coast head of IATSE, like the national organization, IATSE, not just the Chicago chapter. Bayoff somehow was able to squeak by the law the same way Al Capone was for all those years and like not get his hands dirty. And Bayoff would always say that the people who were out to get him were communists who didn't believe in what he was trying to do for industry. Knowing that Bayoff was now coming to California in 1936, 37, and now that he was coming to organize all of these other crafts, not just projectionists, Babbitt was alarmed. He goes to Roy. Roy points him to Gunther Lessing, the vice president. And Gunther Lessing and Art, in conjunction, create this kind of not official union. Lessing is like, let's not make a union. Whoa. We're just going to make a nice organized social group to block Bayoff. That's the goal. And then the more Babbitt dug into this effort, getting his own lawyer to represent the group, his lawyer and like the people who knew what they were doing, who didn't work for the company, said, you can't have Lessing involved. He's management. And if this is going to be an organization to organize people in the company, this is a union. So you have to say you're forming a union, get a charter, get a lawyer. And Babbitt's like, okay, well, I guess this is a union then. And our goal is to block Bayoff, and we need to some basic demands as unions do. And they were pretty much cursory, but really they just wanted the right to be a union in the Disney studio. And they presented that to Gunther Lessing, the vice president who started this. And Lessing's like, there are a lot of people claiming that they are organizing here at Disney. There's you, there's IATSE. And they're like, but Bayoff runs IATSE. He's phony. He's like, no, you still need to go to the National Labor Relations Board and get your certification, your golden star. So Babbitt and his guys go over. It takes like a year and something because the NLRB, the labor office is backed up. Finally, they get this certification, this charter. And they go back to Lessing. They say, okay, we're back in business. It's been a year and a half. And Lessing's like, nah, how can you prove to me that you have like the majority of workers? And Babbitt's like, are you kidding me? So, and he just goes from that to like worse and worse and worse. And pretty soon, and I lay this out in the book, Babbitt starts feeling like a stool pigeon. He was used by the company, which he was anti-Bayoff. The company was anti-Bayoff. It all seemed great on paper. And yet the company was like stalwart in their decision not to have a union, no matter what, et cetera, ... We have the strike. We're a month and a week or so into the strike. And then the strikers find out that Disney, the company, has aligned with Bayoff to block the strikers. It's like, what? Are you serious?
It's the opposite of the whole intent of the initial company union.
Exactly. It was the total opposite. And that seemed to be actually, in a way, kind of helpful for the strikers because they were kind of losing steam up to that point. It had been 5 or 6 weeks. They were exhausted. People weren't getting paid. People were sleeping in the tents that were in the eucalyptus grove across the street. There was a soup kitchen. And then once word got out that Disney signed with Willie Bayoff, this mafia gangster who worked with Al Capone, to be his labor negotiator, oh my God, suddenly all the support started rolling in, support across the country. That kind of support like revitalized their spirits.
A lot of the strikers, they were called communists. Who were there communists among the strikers?
Dave Hilberman, the only confirmed communist among the strikers.
No other communists.
Not that I know of.
That were part of the Communist Party.
Not in the Disney strike. Not in the Disney studio, as far as I know.
So Walt Disney, the key charge that was lobbed at him, he's anti-Semitic. And what evidence have you found on that?
Zero. And I kind of put that in the book, that there was this, smear campaign that went back and forth, the Disney company. And there was this group within the Disney company of artists who call themselves the Committee of 21. This, and the Disney strikers were getting letters from the Committee of 21, and they caricatured them as people wearing like black robes and black hoods, holding signs that said, "Yes, Walt. Yes, Walt." So this anonymous group was accusing the strikers of being communist, of being communist-led, of the people who were like running the strike and the lawyer for the strike to be communists. It was so sensationalist. I have some bits from their letters, from these Committee of 21 letters in the book. And you read it and it's like, these people are so loopy. Clearly, they're just trying to like create an emotional charge in the reader. So there were smears going back and forth. So they're calling the strikers commies. The strikers thought, let's hit Walt where it hurts. And these rumors about Walt being anti-Semitic started. None of these claims are even mentioned or alluded to before the labor unrest. Well, one of the coolest bits of research that I came upon were transcripts of meetings that happened at the Disney studio and that happened in private homes with Disney artists, that they would have the Disney secretaries who were within that club or within that group act as the note taker. And we have transcriptions word for word. And in a meeting from like late 1940, just like maybe like 5 months right before the strike, Babbitt and Bill Roberts and other folks are talking about what should we do union-wise. And Babbitt, who we know from once the strike happens would become most bitter, is saying that Walt is pretty square. And that Walt's biggest problem is that he doesn't notice the effort put in by the lowest level artists. If there was any time to hurl any slurs at Walt, it would have been there. In a private home, Babbitt feeling his feelings, and Babbitt doesn't. Nobody does. There's no claim that that Walt has any personal vendetta against anyone, just that he's stubborn and missing the point. There's no proof, not that I found in all of my deep digging research. And I researched this book for 14 years. I just have nothing that says that Walt Disney was an anti-Semite. What I did learn was that there were people close to him who were Jewish. That's what I uncovered. I found that Gunther Lessing, his vice president, was half Jewish. I learned that Mark Davis was half Jewish, which may be common knowledge to some people right now. Joe Rosenberg, the guy who gave them the money to finish Snow White. Joe Grant, and this is just before 1941. So yeah, I got no evidence. If anything, Walt was just he was anti-socialism because he had such a poor experience with his dad, who was a hardcore socialist, and he was probably, even as an adult, raging against his dad.
What impact do you think that Warner Brothers, the artists at Warner Brothers, had on the Disney strike, if any? Because in the book, Chuck Jones and even Leon Schlesinger, they seem to be at times trolling the Disney studio, taking kind of pleasure in having fun with the strike, and of course helping out the artists. Do you think that had any impact? Do you think the other studios in Hollywood had any impact on the resolution of the strike?
I don't know. It certainly made the strike more entertaining. because whenever you see pictures of like the really cool costumes or the really cool floats or the crafts that people are making, like the guillotine with the Gunther Lessing effigy in the guillotine.
That's Warner Brothers artists, which is insane. Like the actual Disney artists didn't do that, but the Warner crew, they were like, we're gonna create a guillotine for fun.
Yeah. And they had a float where there were pallbearers carrying big empty coffins, and the coffins had the names of the bogus unions, like we're going to bury these bogus unions, parading down the street. The Warner Brothers artists were like really all about the performance aspect of it, and it really gave the Disney artists more wind in their sails.
What do you think was the biggest mistake or kind of miscue that the artists made during the Disney strike that made it become extended as long as it did? Was there anything that they could have done to shorten it, or was it really just the stubbornness of Walt that caused the strike to go on as long as it did?
There's so many what ifs, right? Walt had stubbornness. He had his vice president whispering in his ear. And Lessing was constantly playing on Walt's fears. And you can see that in some of the transcriptions of the meetings that Walt was in, that Lessing is trying to incur stalemate so that he, I guess, remains in Walt's good favor. He just took Walt's fear and pushed it even further, which widened the divide between Disney and the strikers. I think that if there were to be a change, at the very beginning, all it really took would have been just some conversation and some negotiation at the table, just sitting at the table, instead of trying to accuse the other of being this or that, stevedores or gangsters or communists, just to hear out what everyone wanted. And I think that's where the company dropped the ball. If someone had reined in Lessing a little bit, then the strike could have been avoided. Walt was already stubborn. He was a stubborn guy, and because of his father issues, he was anti-socialist. But Lessing kind of created an echo chamber for Walt, and the strikers had their own echo chamber as well, and it became like an us versus them thing. And that is not a way to solve something. In the end, the federal government had to step in to solve it, which is not fun. Without the us versus them, everyone can see each other as a person with goals. Like, I'm not out to destroy you. I'm just out to give myself fair working conditions. That's all. And I think that point was missed. It's kind of similar to, in a lot of ways, where we're at now, where people are stuck in their own echo chambers and no one is hearing the other side. And maybe at the very least, this book is kind of a warning against that, so that we don't get to a place where it becomes, I'm right, you're wrong. We can instead find a place at the table where we can find common ground and negotiate and see that we all want the same thing, which is happiness and peace.
Basic decency towards each other.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a great place to kind of leave this conversation, because the entire book, The Disney Revolt, you have it right behind you as well, but the entire book is one that reads like a thrilling novel. There's elements of danger throughout it, and it is one of the most interesting animation books I've read in a long time. So if you don't have the book yet, you should run out and buy the book, The Disney Revolt, The Great Labor War of Animation's Golden Age by Jake S. Friedman. Jake, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Amit.